If you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth. Then I remembered Occam's razor. Occam's razor is that the simplest answer is most likely the correct one. So I was left with only one conclusion, that this cloth could only be the authentic burial shroud of the historic Jesus.
The first reason is related to a March 2019 study where a replica of the Shroud of Turin was attempted. The results stated that the perfect reproduction of the Turin shroud remains a challenge since many other characteristics of the original image have not yet been obtained with any of the processes used for reproduction to date.
Putting a dead body, wrapping it in linen, will not leave an image like the shroud behind. The only image that you would have would be the bloodstains as a result of body-to-cloth contact. There's not going to be a thin, superficial image over those bloodstains. We have over 1,000 burial cloths from antiquity that had bodies in them. Not a single one has an image on it except this one.
We discovered that the image is not the result of any paint, stain, dye, powder, acid, oil, or any other chemical, nor is it attributed to heat or scorch. Recall that the image is due to a change in the covalent bonds between carbon atoms in the cellulose molecules of the flax fibrils themselves. We've experimentally determined that heat can induce the molecular change in the flax fibrils. However, heat cannot create shaded regions with an equal extent of fibril change, and it cannot create a 3D depth map. There's a theory out there called the shadow shroud, which posits an inverted painting on glass that the sun could bleach areas of the shroud lighter than others, effectively creating the 3D depth map of light and dark. But while sun bleaching could induce a molecular change in the fibrils, it wouldn't be the same since the darkened fibrils would be unchanged while the lighter ones would be chemically modified. In fact, so far, the only one process which has been able to produce all of the chemical effects of the fibrils and result in a 3D depth map of a man on the linen is radiation.
We've seen examples of how a flash of radiation can create images with medical X-ray photos and with the shadow victims of the Hiroshima bomb. But what created the Shroud of Turin differs in that it was more fine-tuned. It didn't penetrate through to reveal bones like an X-ray does, nor was there as much heat as the Hiroshima blast, as that would have incinerated the cloth itself.
But if radiation is in fact the best explanation for how the image was formed, that raises some big questions for both major hypotheses. We have absolutely no idea how a medieval artist could have used a controlled radiation source to create the image in the shroud. In fact, do we even possess this ability today? No, we don't. The previously cited result comes from simulation only, because even with our advanced technology today, we cannot reproduce the image with all of the same chemical effects we observe in the shroud. But for those who claim authenticity, why would we believe that a human body could emit radiation? Do we have any scientific evidence of a body emitting radiation? Surprisingly, we do. In 2018, we captured for the first time the radiation of zinc molecules from a human egg through the natural processes at the moment of fertilization. This result doesn't necessarily mean that we can say for certain that Jesus' body emitted some sort of particle radiation while wrapped in the shroud, but it certainly makes it physically and scientifically possible.
What science is telling us is that a dead body would have to exude billions of watts to create the image on the shroud. Fabrics are not supposed to contain precise 3D images. As you can see here, a three-dimensional image can be taken from this two-dimensional cloth. This three-dimensional nature inspired the Shroud of Turin research project, also known as STURP, which was the most thorough analysis of the shroud to date. The 33-person team was comprised of experts in various fields who spent 17 months preparing for the analysis. They did incredible work, and here they tested several types of images and were not able to obtain the three-dimensional style that the shroud had. To date, this three-dimensional nature could not be matched. The data from the study actually allowed the face of Christ to be modeled by the History Channel, which you'll see here. The third reason is that the Shroud of Turin matches bloodstains on the sudarium of Oviedo. The sudarium is the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, as mentioned in John 20:7. There was a study that compared bloodstains as well as calcium and strontium deposits between the shroud and the sudarium. The results suggest that both cloths were used by the same person. The fourth reason I believe are due to the new studies that provide an updated age for the shroud. In 1988, the carbon dating results provided a date in the 1300s. This made many people believe it was a forgery for decades. However, in the early 2000s, Ray Rogers was challenged to look into this further, and he discovered that the wrong samples were selected for the dating. Using tape samples taken from the shroud, he concluded the radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and was invalid for determining the age of the shroud. He also calculated a new date between 1300 and 3000 years old.
Despite every bit of scientific and historical evidence pointing to the authenticity of the shroud, many people continue to reject it based on the medieval carbon date. So I did a deep dive into the carbon dating result to see what's actually there. We observed that when combined, the uncertainty of all the samples across the 3 labs was well outside the 2 sigma acceptable limit. But when plotted against the distance from the edge of the shroud, we discovered there's actually a positive correlation between the calculated age and the distance from the edge. We also reviewed the very tight correlation between the sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin, despite the fact that they carbon date to 600 years apart. These 3 facts gave us significant cause to question the veracity of the carbon dating results, but we needed a hypothesis that could explain all of the phenomena we find in the data. We found it in Robert Rucker's neutron absorption hypothesis. We heard about the theory of particle radiation emitting from the body in the shroud, energized neutrons which reacted with the nitrogen atoms in the shroud to produce new carbon-14 atoms.
In other words, the radiation that caused the image to be formed was the very thing that skewed the results of the carbon-14 dating test.
He has presented a way to know for certain if this theory is true by carbon testing a piece of the shroud from the center of the mass, which would date to thousands of years in the future.
The fifth reason I believe is due to the medical accuracy of the shroud. The examiner from the research team wrote, "The largest blood stain on the burial cloth is on the right side of the chest. It covers the area of the 5th and 6th ribs. This stain very clearly shows separation of blood from a clear watery material." What did John's Gospel say? That after Jesus was pierced, blood and water came out. This is medically confirmed here. The examiner even states, the author cannot help but comment that a remarkable consistency exists between the Gospel accounts and the forensic pathological findings depicted on the Shroud of Turin.
The thing that stopped me from accepting the shroud as authentic for years, the blood on the shroud is still red. Old blood should be black or brown. In a telephone conversation with Dr. Alan Adler, Jewish blood chemist, who proved, by the way, the blood on the shroud was blood, proved it. And he told me something I'd never known before. When someone is tortured over an extended period of time, 24 hours, 36 hours, right around the time of Jesus' torture, the body goes into shock. After a period of time in this type of shock, the cell walls of the red blood cells begin to break down, and the liver floods the body, the bloodstream, with an enzyme called bilirubin. And when that happens, the blood stays red forever. And when I found that out, that was the last piece of the puzzle.
The sixth reason I believe is due to the pollen studies. Max Frey used adhesive tapes to collect dust samples from the Shroud of Turin during the 1978 STURP investigation. He later classified 58 pollen grains by comparing them to pollen grains in the largest botanical museums around the world. He concluded that a majority of the pollen grains were from Jerusalem. The seventh reason I believe is due to the coins placed over the man's eyes. This was indicated initially by the STURP team and published in the Numismatist. This was confirmed by imaging analyst expert Robert Haralick, who said the shroud did indeed contain a faint image of the Pilate coin.
This is typical of the lepton, or the widow's mite, struck by Pontius Pilate in the years in 29 AD to 33. It also localizes it to Israel, since these coins are just the widow's mites, or the common penny of the time, and certainly would not circulate either outside of Israel or not very long after the reign of Tiberius Caesar, to which they were dedicated.
The eighth reason I believe is that there is AB blood on the shroud. The blood that is on the sudarium is also AB blood, and so is the blood from every other Eucharistic miracle.